Fair Isle, Scotland, 1970. Undersea archaeologist Colin Martin makes an incredible discovery. The undisturbed remains of a ship that belonged to the Spanish Armada.
Looks like a gun carriage. It's the first gun carriage I've ever seen on an Armada wreck.
Among the artifacts Martin recovers are enticing clues to the mystery of that great fleet. Questions that have baffled historians for centuries. How could such an impressive force fail in its invasion of England, a war the Spanish believed they were guaranteed to win?
With its gun mounted, it must have been extended at least halfway across the deck.
Before the discovery of a number of Armada wrecks, we only knew what the documents could tell us. By finding the Armada wrecks, investigating them with modern archaeological techniques, and piecing together the reality of the ships before they became wrecks, we were, in effect, going back through time.
1558. The massive Spanish Empire is poised to encircle the globe. With lands that range from Madrid to Macau, Habsburg King Philip II rules as the most powerful sovereign in the world.
It's with the conquest of the Philippines, which began in 1565, that one can say that the empire was one in which the sun never set. The addition of the Portuguese realms to it, of course, rounds it out. But once you've got the Philippines on the far side of the globe, you've got such an empire.
The staunchly religious King Philip II attempts to bring all Catholic nations under one umbrella. Part of his strategy includes marrying the Catholic Queen of England, Mary Tudor, a calculated move intended to provide some protection for Philip's Dutch holdings against a French invasion.
One of the big attractions of marrying Mary Tudor, a woman much older than Philip, probably beyond the childbearing age, but nevertheless the ruler of the country on the other side of the Netherlands. So uniting England and the Netherlands provided a safety net on the other side.
At her new husband Philip's urging, Queen Mary begins amassing a modern navy. She christens the first new ship, Philip and Mary, in honor of their union. But trouble is on the horizon. Queen Mary is dying of ovarian cancer. When Mary's half-sister, Elizabeth I, takes control of the throne in 1558, she immediately begins reverting England to a Protestant regime. In a last-ditch attempt to stop the change, Philip shocks the world by proposing to Elizabeth.
Believe me, if it were not for God's sake, I would never do this. Nothing could or would make me do this except the clear knowledge that it might gain the kingdom of England for his service and faith.
Elizabeth rebuffs her reluctant suitor, and Philip returns to Spain, temporarily abandoning all hopes of keeping Catholicism alive in England.
Philip and Elizabeth coexist reasonably well for the first 10 years of their reign. And then Francis Drake and John Hawkins come back from the Caribbean to England and say, we have been attacked by the Spaniards.
For several years, English Captain John Hawkins and his young protege Francis Drake have plied a lucrative slave trade route between Africa and the Spanish towns in the Americas, much to the chagrin of King Philip.
Technically, these people were pirates, and not many of them had any real authority from Elizabeth, even if she invested in their voyages. Drake claimed to have had the Queen's okay, but never shows it to anybody. So, in effect, the Spaniards regard this as pure piracy.
When storms force Hawkins' battered ships to seek shelter in a Mexican port, the Spanish Navy seizes the opportunity to spring a trap on the unsuspecting Englishmen.
Hawkins and some of his men were just barely able to escape to one of the other ships called the Minion. And Drake himself got into a very small ship, and Hawkins sent him orders, come back, I've got too many men on this ship and I want you to take some of them off. Well, Drake didn't come back, and he went off by himself and left Hawkins with his overloaded ship to make his own way out of the harbor.
Standing by her pirate captains, Elizabeth retaliates for the attack on the English ships by taking 5 Spanish treasure galleons hostage. A furious King Philip begins plotting a way to depose Elizabeth's reign. He unexpectedly receives the perfect opportunity in 1570 when Pope Pius V excommunicates the Queen.
Pius V's bull declares Elizabeth deposed and authorizes any Catholic to kill her and any Catholic monarch to depose her. And the Pope turns to Philip II and says, "How about you?" At first the king says, not really interested. But then the papal agent in England, a man called Roberto Ridolfi, arrives at the court of Spain and says, "Have I got a plot for you?"
Ridolfi's intricate plan to kill Elizabeth and replace her with the Catholic Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart, intrigues Philip. He pledges an invasion force to support the insurrection, but never gets to unleash it. Elizabeth's spies uncover the plot.
She arrests the conspirators. After the Ridolfi plot, Elizabeth is prepared to support any opponent of Philip II.
Elizabeth begins openly providing money and soldiers to the Dutch in their fight against Spain. She further implements a campaign to attack Philip where he is most vulnerable, in his pocketbook. Beginning in 1572, Elizabeth unleashes Hawkins and Drake in a series of pirating expeditions. They brazenly plunder Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, capturing countless rich prizes. Francis Drake gains an almost mythical reputation among the Spanish for his feats of skill and daring.
When they sent their reports back home, they didn't report that we've had an English pirate stop here and burn town. They would say, we've had the worst pirate imaginable stop here. He's not only a pirate and an English pirate, but it's Drake, the Dragon, El Drago.
While Philip sends a huge fleet to hunt Drake down, the wily mariner turns west and returns to England by circumnavigating the earth, the first Englishman ever to accomplish this incredible feat.
We call it circumnavigation. It is a record of very successful plunder, attack, assassination, and capture carried out by Drake around the world, always at Philip II's expense.
Philip seethes with each new report of an English attack, but resists making a decisive response. The king is finally forced to take action in 1585 when Drake raids the Spanish ports of Galicia, reportedly desecrating churches and attacking priests and nuns.
This is war, and Philip II immediately writes to the Pope and says, "I'm ready now, Your Holiness, to do what you asked me before. I will depose Elizabeth, and I will do it now."
When we continue, Philip masterminds a seemingly unbeatable religious crusade against England.
When the Marquis of Santa Cruz quite reasonably says, "How are we going to get good weather going up the channel?" the king says, "Look, God will provide good weather." Well, this is a poor substitute for strategy.
With the sting of Francis Drake's recent raids still fresh in his mind, King Philip II of Spain makes the momentous decision to invade England and unseat Queen Elizabeth in 1585.
He writes to his leading commanders, the Duke of Parma, who commands his army in the Netherlands, and the Marquis of Santa Cruz, who commands his fleet in Lisbon, and says, "Okay, boys, I want to invade England. Give me a plan." So the boys consult their experts, and they come up with wonderful plans in which, of course, they each play the starring role.
The Marquis of Santa Cruz responds first with his plan for a great sea armada to sail to England and land an invasion force. 18 days later, the Duke of Parma delivers a 28-page letter to the king detailing his plan, a blitzkrieg attack on London using his army in the Netherlands.
Santa Cruz and Parma each presented his own scheme to Philip II, and Philip II sorted through them and began to come up with a plan of his own.
In a fateful decision, Philip orders the two plans to be combined. The Marquis of Santa Cruz will sail from Lisbon with a massive sea armada, pick up the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, and together lay siege to London. The grand scheme so enamors Philip that he seems blinded to the dangers inherent in attempting to join up two huge military forces separated by 1,000 sea miles.
Every Spanish officer who knew about these things had recognized this as a fundamental weakness from the very outset.
When the Marquis of Santa Cruz quite reasonably says, how are we going to get good weather going up the channel? The king says, look, God will provide good weather. Well, this is a poor substitute for strategy.
No sooner has the ink dried on Philip's secret invasion plan than word of it passes to Elizabeth through her spies. The Queen has long suspected that Philip might try to invade her country, so in 1583, in preparation, she established a royal commission on the Navy. The commission continues the build-up begun when Philip was married to Queen Mary, but with a twist. All new ships are constructed on a radical race-built design, featuring lower fore and aft castles, sleeker lines, and a longer gun deck.
The race-built galleon, which is a very sleek, fast galleon, very maneuverable, packing a very, very heavy punch of artillery, was completely different from the Spanish troop-carrying warship, which was really an invasion transport.
Elizabeth also has all her older ships pulled from service and refitted to race-built specifications. The Philip and Mary, built to honor King Philip, is rechristened Nonpareil and made ready to attack him instead.
One of the great ironies of history is that Philip, as a young man, came over to England, and one of the few things he did was to start to modernize the English Navy. The very ships that some years later would be at the forefront of England's defense against Philip's own armada from Spain.
Hoping to buy more time to prepare her defenses, Elizabeth once again unleashes Sir Francis Drake. On April 29, 1587, the mariner pulls a daring sneak attack on the Bay of Cadiz, where many Armada ships are being outfitted.
Drake went through the harbor, shooting his guns off and boarding the ships, taking whatever he needed off of the ships, and whatever he couldn't carry with him, he burned.
In less than a day, Drake loots and destroys 24 Armada ships. Frightened that the brazen pirate will next ambush the treasure fleet, Philip orders Santa Cruz to take 37 of the remaining Armada ships and chase the Englishman. Elizabeth's gambit works. The Armada's preparations are completely disrupted.
Drake's destruction of the shipping in the port of Cadiz set the Spanish back about a year, and the work that had been done on the fleet to that time had to be done over again.
It is not until 5 months later that Santa Cruz returns with a fleet decimated by storms and illness, sorely requiring repair. The king, though, desperately needs the Armada to sail. It has become a huge financial drain on Philip, and he badgers Santa Cruz.
So much time has been lost already that every further hour of delay causes me more grief than you can imagine. I charge and command you most strictly to leave before the end of the month.
Santa Cruz cannot meet the king's demands. He contracts typhus and dies on February 9th, leaving behind an Armada in shambles without a leader.
The king has to find someone quick. No one in Lisbon has the experience and the social status to command a very aristocratic fleet. The fleet has attracted all sorts of notable Spaniards to serve with it. So whoever's going to take over from the Marquis has to have social cachet. And on that score, the Duke of Medina Sidonia is an obvious choice.
Even with the correct title and lineage for the appointment, Medina Sidonia has little naval experience.
When Medina Sidonia received the appointment from Philip, he apparently was dumbstruck. He knew the problems, and I think he honestly felt he was not the man for the job.
I have no doubt that His Majesty will do me the favor which I humbly beg, and will not entrust me to a task of which certainly I shall not give a good account. For I do not understand it, know nothing about it, have no health for the sea, and have no money to spend upon it.
And why, you may wonder, does the king still go ahead? And the answer is very interesting. The king's secretaries read the letter and they don't pass it on. They write back to Medina Sidonia and say, "Got your letter. We haven't shown it to the king because everybody knows you've been offered the job. And if it became known that you had written in this pusillanimous way, your credit would go right down. And that's a palpable threat, and it gets his mark. Medina Sidonia is on his horse within a week going to Lisbon."
The fate of the Armada now lies in the hands of the reluctant and inexperienced 38-year-old Duke of Medina Sidonia. When we continue, the English Navy gets its first horrifying glimpse of the invincible Spanish Armada.
It's hard to imagine how awesome the Spanish Armada must have appeared to the English when they first saw it. It's a larger concentration than probably anyone alive had ever seen.
When the Marquis of Santa Cruz dies suddenly, King Philip II rushes to find a replacement who can whip his grand Spanish Armada into shape. He decides on the 38-year-old Duke of Medina Sidonia.
Philip II appoints him. He's reluctant to go, but he goes to Lisbon, and hey presto, within 6 weeks, the Armada's at sea. 6 weeks, it's out. That's not bad.
A punctilious organizer, the Duke set sail in record time, with an armada containing about 19,000 soldiers, 7,000 sailors, 1,000 gentlemen adventurers, 180 Catholic clerics, and 130 ships to carry them all. To the crowds who daily line the docks, the Armada appears invincible, but looks might be deceiving.
In order to get the ships necessary for such an operation, Philip of Spain had to ransack his whole empire, mainly for merchant ships that could be converted for this purpose.
The Armada very much a kind of hodgepodge, I think you might call it. The ship types were varied, the guns aboard varied, the people aboard varied. Everything was lacking any kind of real unity.
To arm this disparate fleet, Medina Sidonia commandeers every gun in the vast Spanish Empire and presses local foundries to hurriedly produce additional cannons. Quantity has become more important than quality in the rush to launch the Armada. As a result, many of the fleet's 2,431 guns are poorly made.
The variations in them is quite extraordinary. For instance, the Castilian squadron, with some very nice ships, is not very heavily gunned, mostly 12-pounders, which are fine for dealing with corsairs and pirates, but not for a head-on naval engagement.
May 25th, 1588. Medina Sidonia sends a messenger off to the Duke of Parma, commander of the Spanish land forces in the Netherlands, informing him that the Grand Armada is setting sail. He recommends that Parma begin preparing his troops for their rendezvous and subsequent invasion of Protestant England. Christened La Armada Felicissima, or the Most Fortunate Fleet, and flying the flag of Catholic Crusade, King Philip considers his flotilla invincible, protected by the hand of God.
His instructions to the Armada all emphasize the sacred enterprise in which the fleet is engaged. He makes special provision that there should be no blasphemy, no sodomy, no women on board, nothing that could possibly compromise the religious tone of the whole enterprise.
Fate soon mysteriously puts Philip's belief to a test, as the Armada encounters violent, unseasonable squalls. By June 24th, they have only reached the northern port of Corunna when a huge storm hits, scattering the ships. In a letter to the king, Medina Sidonia questions whether God is truly with the expedition, causing Philip to angrily respond.
I have dedicated this enterprise to God. Pull yourself together then, and do your part.
July 29th, 1588. Warning beacons flare across the English countryside, proclaiming that the Armada has been sighted just off the coast. There is a famous story that Sir Francis Drake is bowling on Plymouth Hoe when the news reaches him, and that the captain haughtily replies,
"We have enough time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too."
While the story is probably apocryphal, the fact is that the English do not immediately take to their ships. With the wind and tide flowing towards Plymouth, they are trapped within their own harbor. Juan Martinez de Recalde, second in command of the Armada, recognizes the predicament facing the English fleet and sends a note to Medina Sidonia recommending a full-scale attack on Plymouth Harbor.
I believe if they pressed on and got to the entrance to Plymouth Harbor and perhaps launched a few fire ships inside, the English would have been finished. But Medina Sidonia has strict orders not to fight unless he has to. His mission is to join up with the Duke of Parma and invade England. He therefore decides to ignore those who suggest attacking Plymouth and proceed up the channel, thus allowing the English to get out and to fight him. It's a close call. I believe it was the wrong call.
With the first morning light of July 31st, Armada lookouts are shocked to find that a large group of ships has magically appeared to windward. In a Herculean effort, rowboats have dragged the 70 English ships out of Plymouth Harbor. Under cover of darkness, Lord Admiral Charles Howard has led his English Navy around the Armada and gained an important advantage called the weather gauge.
For sailing ships engaged in a battle, the people who are upwind have the advantage. So getting the weather gauge, as it's called, gives you an immediate advantage over your foe. And this the English did at an early stage.
Confronted by the English fleet, the Armada deftly falls into a pre-arranged crescent-shaped battle formation, with the strongest ships along the leading horns and the weaker ships protected inside.
And the English must have thought, oh my goodness, these guys know what they're doing, because this is a very impressive navigational feat. It's hard to imagine how awesome the Spanish Armada must have appeared to the English when they first saw it. It's a larger concentration that probably anyone alive had ever seen.
The good formation discipline that the Spaniards were maintaining made the Spanish Armada a very, very formidable thing to attack. And the English, at the beginning at any rate, didn't have the faintest idea to how to go about it.
Like David meeting Goliath, the English ships come at the Armada tentatively, choosing one Spanish ship on the fringes of the formation to pummel with a far-off cannonade. The San Juan de Portugal, flagship of second-in-command Juan Martinez de Recalde, experiences the first assault, receiving more than 300 hits. Although the distant fire does little real damage, Recalde fears that the Spanish hodgepodge of guns is no match for the superior English firepower.
Since our Mediterranean ships do not carry as much heavy artillery as the enemy, the latter will get closer and cause them some damage.
Recalde's ship survives the first day's battle, but other Spanish ships are not as fortunate.
A ship called the San Salvador blew up and had to be abandoned by the Spaniards. In the confusion surrounding this incident, another ship, the Nuestra Señora del Rosario, one of the biggest and best armed ships in the fleet, collided with one of her comrades.
It loses its mainmast, and a ship without a mainmast can't sail. So Medina Sidonia, first of all, tries to throw a rope to it. It breaks. And then he has to decide, do we wait until it refits, or do we press on following our orders? We got to get to Flanders as quick as possible. And in the end, they decide to do that.
Second-in-command Juan de Recalde vehemently opposes the decision, but is once again overruled by the obstinate Medina Sidonia. The Rosario, with 50,000 ducats of the king's money and huge stores of precious gunpowder aboard, is abandoned and left to fend for herself against the ravenous British fleet. When we continue, Francis Drake discovers the secret weakness of the Armada's defenses.
It is interesting that it's Drake's ship which keeps pushing the envelope, if you like. It looks as if he's waiting to see what the Spaniards can do back, and the answer is they do nothing.
With sunrise on August 1st, 1588, the commander of the injured Spanish ship Rosario is stunned to find that the Armada is nowhere in sight. It has abandoned him and continued on towards its meeting with the Duke of Parma's forces in Flanders. Shadowing the wounded vessel is a lone English galleon, the Revenge, the personal flagship of Francis Drake. The Rosario's commander faces a crucial decision.
The commander, a man called Don Pedro de Valdez, one of the members of the Council of War, he knows absolutely everything about the Armada plan. And he says, I'll only surrender to Sir Francis Drake in person. And the message comes back, curiously enough, Drake is on board the ship that you see before you. So they say, oh, well, fair enough. And Drake comes aboard, takes the sword, and he then keeps Don Pedro with him.
Fellow Captain Martin Frobisher derides Drake's actions. To capture the Rosario, Drake has abandoned his lead position in the fleet, allowing the other ships to become scattered during the night.
His comrades were furious, not, it may be said, for putting them into such fearful risk, but for getting at the treasure first.
Frobisher, when he found out what Drake had done, said he thought that Drake had done it either out of cowardice or out of treason. He said, I don't know which it is, but I'll swear to one of them.
What Frobisher does not know is that Drake may have captured more than treasure from the Rosario and its captain.
It's just a theory, but it would seem to me that the direct experience of talking to one of the squadron commanders and in a very subtle, low-key interrogation, perhaps discovering how they intended to fight, it's like getting the other side's secret plans. The next day, Drake goes for another Spanish ship, sails round and round and round it, firing broadsides. It looks as if he's waiting to see what the Spaniards can do back, and the answer is they do nothing.
In the days following the capture of the Rosario, the English captains become bolder, venturing closer to the Spanish ships and raking them with relentless fire. Still, no amount of cannon shot seems able to slow the unrelenting push of the unstoppable Armada as it heads north towards the Netherlands to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army and invade England. Ironically, Spanish commander Medina Sidonia finds no comfort in the steady progress of his fleet. Despite dispatching daily messengers, Medina Sidonia has yet to receive any word from the Duke of Parma.
He writes almost every day, Dear Duke, haven't heard from you, what's going on? And he never seems to get it, that it's very difficult to row a boat or sail a boat to the Netherlands and then get one back again.
Communication in the 16th century was always a major problem. We are so accustomed to instant communications that I think we fail to grasp the scale of the problem. It's certainly one of the great flaws in the whole campaign.
Medina Sidonia convenes a council of war, which recommends that the Armada anchor in the protected harbor behind the Isle of Wight until word is received that Parma's troops are ready to sail out from the Netherlands and meet the Armada. August 4th, 1588, Medina Sidonia orders a course set towards the safe harbor.
But the English had discerned their intentions. The inshore squadron under Martin Frobisher cuts in between the Spaniards and the shore, and in fact starts pushing the Spaniards towards some rather dangerous shoals.
With the Armada blocked from entering the harbor, Admiral Howard, John Hawkins, and Francis Drake fearlessly lead their squadrons into the midst of the fleet, pounding them with relentless fire. A fierce battle rages for hours, and when the smoke clears, the Armada has drifted beyond the safety of the Isle of Wight.
So both sides know that there's no way for the Spaniards to stop between the Isle of Wight and the narrow seas. So that's probably why the next 3 days is virtually no fighting.
Medina Sidonia has no other option but to continue on in the blind faith that Parma is ready for the rendezvous. His hope is dashed a day later, when a messenger finally arrives to inform him that the Duke had not embarked a barrel of beer, still less a soldier.
Little does he know that it's only earlier that same day that Parma has the first message saying that the Armada left Spain. So there's no way he can be ready, but he does his best. He gets the troops ready, he marches them to the coast, he starts embarking them.
The various people racing back and forth came back with various versions of how ready Parma really was. Some said a couple of days, some thought maybe 2 weeks.
Medina Sidonia grasps at his last desperate option. He will anchor the Armada in the hazardous tide race off of Calais and wait for Parma's troops to arrive by barge. If he can just hold out long enough, the commander knows that a rendezvous still might be obtained and victory achieved.
The fate of the Tudor state hangs in the balance for 36 hours. It's only the English fleet which stands between the Armada and the invasion. There are no fortifications between the coast of Kent, where Parma intended to land, and London. And I believe under an experienced commander like Parma, they would have captured London and perhaps even taken the Queen too.
English Admiral Charles Howard recognizes that the entire balance of victory hangs on his next decision. He must strike a decisive blow. He decides to launch a fireship attack. 8 ships filled with combustibles are set alight, and the floating bombs sent in on the current toward the Spanish fleet.
And the burning ships would go in among the anchored Armada, hopefully setting fire to them, but much more to the point, causing panic. And panic was caused to the Spaniards on this one occasion. Up to that point, their discipline had been tremendous, but they panicked, cut their anchor cables, and were dispersed by the wind into the North Sea.
In the morning, Medina Sidonia finds that only 5 Spanish ships remain anchored, surrounded by the entire English fleet.
This was what the English had been waiting for. They'd scattered the Armada, they'd driven them into the North Sea. Now they could throw everything they had at them.
Medina Sidonia and the ever-faithful Recalde bravely turn to face the assault. It comes with withering intensity. Medina Sidonia's galleon San Martin receives 107 direct hits on the hull, masts, and sails. The English attack at such close range, the insults can be shouted between ships.
The Spanish commander got out his grappling hooks and he hollered to the English to let him come in close and fight like men. And he said, "You're English cowards and you're Lutheran chickens. Come and fight."
Other Spanish ships return and join the fight, but to no avail. The maelstrom from the English is relentless. Blood pours from the decks of the Armada ships as more than 1,000 Spaniards are killed and 800 wounded. Amazingly, only 100 Englishmen are wounded. The assault finally ends when the English ships run out of ammunition, but the damage is already done. During the heat of battle, the strong current has pushed the crippled, scattered Spanish ships into the North Sea and away from any hope of joining up with Parma's army. Refusing to admit defeat, Medina Sidonia signals the fleet to regroup. When some ships refuse, the angry Duke has one of the offending captains hanged on the spot, leaving the body dangling from the yardarm as a warning to the others.
Recalde, as the second in command, is summoned, and he said, "No, I'm not going because nobody listens to me anyway."
Finally, even Medina Sidonia must admit defeat. He knows that his fleet cannot fight the strong currents and re-enter the English Channel. And without it, Parma's army cannot invade England. Amazingly, an outmanned English fleet has beaten the seemingly unstoppable La Armada Felicissima. When we continue, modern explorers uncover the secrets of the Spanish Armada.
Quite early on, we began to recognize big faults in at least some of the Spanish cannon. In all probability, if they were fired with a full charge, they'd blow up in the faces of the people who fired them.
Adrift in the North Sea, Medina Sidonia and his commanders take stock of their rapidly dwindling options.
They decide that the best thing to do is to get the fleet back to Spain, and the only safe route back, without having to go into action again with the English who have worsted you, is to go around Scotland.
No sooner had the ships charted a northern course than they encounter a string of massive storms. Many of the crippled ships lose their riggings and crash onto the inhospitable shores of Scotland and Ireland. Those who don't drown find themselves at the mercy of the English soldiers stationed there.
The sad truth is the English just rounded them up and shot them. The English, of course, later go on to claim that the wild Irish savages beat them to death for their money and jewels. But the reality was the English themselves were the chief culprits in the slaughter of several thousand Spaniards who maybe landed alive on the Irish shore.
September 21st, 1588. 2 months to the day since his joyful departure from Corunna, Medina Sidonia limps back to Spain with 8 battered galleons. His flagship is literally held together by ropes tied around the hull. Of the 130 ships that sailed for England, 70 are gone, along with 12,500 men. Admiral Juan Martinez de Recalde, the Armada's second-in-command, also makes it back to Spain, only to die 2 weeks after his return.
In a way, Recalde has the last word, you know, because the last thing he does in this life is to send off, in fact, a dossier which clearly criticizes, very specifically and repeatedly, the decisions taken by his supreme commander, Medina Sidonia. But the king probably never reads them.
As a result, the official inquiries exonerate Medina Sidonia and Parma, but never answer the central question: why did the Armada fail?
When the Armada failed, of course, that the first thing everybody did was ascribe the victory or the defeat to God. In England and in the Dutch Republic, great processions and religious services were held thanking God for the victory. The experts, however, went back to the drawing board.
Through the centuries, experts put forth many theories as to why the Armada failed. In 1967, the argument gains new life when archaeologists discover the first of 8 Armada wreck sites off the coast of Ireland. What they find among the remains of the Santa Maria de la Rosa surprises them.
The first Armada wreck we found didn't have any cannons on it at all. But what we were really surprised to find was this large heap of cannonballs, because all the historians had told us that the reason the Armada failed, or one of the reasons the Armada failed, was that they ran out of shot.
It is several years before Dr. Colin Martin uncovers the next piece in the puzzle: intact cannons. A few of the giant guns exhibit dire manufacturing defects, making them prone to explode. But all are plagued by one common problem. Dr. Martin finds that each of the hodgepodge of cannons requires a unique ball size, a terribly confusing and inefficient system when mired in the heat of battle.
The problems that the Spaniards had in getting the right shot to the right guns on board the right ships was absolutely enormous, and the reality seems to have been there was muddle on a gigantic scale, and that most of the ships actually had cannonballs of the wrong size for the cannons they had on board.
To make matters worse, further searching shows that many of the largest Spanish guns were mounted on massive 2-wheeled land carriages. Such an unwieldy arrangement made them virtually impossible to move and reload during battle.
So essentially, the Spaniards had a one-off salvo, and thereafter they had great difficulty in firing again. The English, having developed mobile artillery tactics, they could load and reload throughout an action with their very compact design of sea carriage. The truck carriage was their secret weapon in 1588.
Could it be these weaknesses in Spanish weaponry that Sir Francis Drake discovered when he captured the Rosario and her captain, Don Pedro de Valdez? Was it the secret key that finally allowed the English fleet to inflict damage on the Armada at Gravelines?
Drake is a very fluent man. He speaks Spanish. very suave, very urbane. He would have noticed that the ship, although a large ship, has guns with very, very long gun carriages, and he would have said, well, how were you planning to reload them? And Don Pedro was, well, of course, we never thought of that. We thought one round, you see, and we'd come and board you. It's very interesting. Tell me more. And one can't help feeling that this extended debriefing probably provided Drake with an awful lot of information.
While Colin Martin's discoveries shed new light on the mystery of why the Armada proved ineffective in battle, some experts believe that they are just symptoms of a much larger problem.
The real failure, the fundamental failure, goes back to the strategic and planning level. This is not a good plan. To expect a fleet to join up with an army 1,000 miles away in the age of sail is not good.
This mystery is so big that even the naked archaeologist needs some help from friends. Join the ultimate search posse as they search for the mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Is it possible that Mount Sinai is not even in Egypt?